Hello and welcome to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are extra excited to be able to have this episode rolling out because this is our 50th episode. So a whole lot of hard work by a whole lot of people on the team here at Mississippi College, particularly, and don't edit this out, Evelyn, but Evelyn Parsley is our student who has done a fantastic job of being our editor for all of our episodes of the podcast. And one of the reasons that the podcast has been successful is we found really great people as guests who are subject matter experts to help us discuss more things in Christian history. And one of the people who have helped us a great deal in finding those guests is our guest today. So how about all of that? So Dr. Jennifer Woodruff Tait with Christian History Magazine is our guest today. And our focus is to talk about Annie do you say Weinmeier? How do you say her?
Wittenmyer.
Wittenmeier is how we're going to say it.
Wittenmyer. That's
Witten,
full of
yes. Oh, I'm
T's.
sorry.
Yes.
I left my T's out. Witten, right, I had to
Yeah.
do, who was the first president of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. Some of you may recall that we did a Christian History Chronicles on the temperance movement that Dr. Woodruff Tait did for us. Her husband has been a podcast guest, and we love our relationship with Christian History Magazine. And eventually, I'm going to be quiet, okay, and let her be able to talk. So thank you for joining us, and thank you again for all you've done to help us to make this podcast successful.
Well, I'm always glad to be here.
Well, I mean, it's always good info for us to have. So let's talk a little bit about Annie Wittenmyer and give us maybe a little background on what the WCTU was and why we would be talking about her at all, period, about the
Yeah, well, she
WTCU.
was the first president of the WCTU, which is Women's Christian Temperance Union. I have not women's, even though they had
Women's.
many women who were part of it. But I have had so
Good.
many fights with proofreaders about this in my life, writing about temperance. So like each woman was having their own commitment to temperance, I guess,
Good.
is so anyway, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. She was the first president. She's much less famous than her successor, Frances Willard, who we're going to talk about in a minute. But she was she was born in 1827, and she's a Methodist. Not everyone, but a lot of people involved with the temperance movement were Methodists. It was, most Protestant churches, Lutherans were kind of an exception, but most Protestant churches were very committed to temperance. But Methodists, you'll generally find Methodists in the front of the pack in that. And she was a leader. Her name was Annie Turner Wittenmyer. We call her Annie Wittenmyer, but she actually divorced her husband fairly early in their relationship
Oh, really?
because he abandoned her. I assume that he went off with somebody else. That's usually what that term meant in the 19th century. So all of this she was doing. She was actually doing as a divorced woman. She had four children, but three of them died in infancy.
Mm,
She started out in reform during the Civil War. She did nursing in hospitals and also wrote about the conditions in hospitals. And so she was involved in, helping soldiers, helping orphans, and she worked for the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church. She was mainly known as a writer, so she began to write these books. She edited periodicals. She wrote
mm.
hymns. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm sure that you might be singing it. Look to him and look down. It was written by Annie Wittenmyer. And eventually she was among the people, many of whom were Methodist, who founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the WCTU, which I'm going to keep saying so I don't have to remember to say women's,
Yes, thank you.
WCTU, grew so it began in the 1870s, and it grew out of something called the Women's Crusade, which was something that took place mostly, as I recall, in Ohio, although I think it spread to some other places, where women would gather in front of saloons, they would pray, they would practice forms of nonviolent protest. Sometimes people would, throw water on them and yell at them and do all sorts of things to get them to go away. And they just kept silently witnessing and praying in front of saloons. and it became this huge movement. And there's a great book about it, if you ever want to read about it, called "Give
Hmm.
to the Winds Thy Fears." Winds with a D. The guy who wrote it is called Jack Blocker. This is a book from like the 70s. He's been dead a long time, but when I first started researching temperance many years ago, it was a really foundational book. So anyway, so the Women's Crusade was amazing, and then there were people who said, okay, we need to channel this energy. We need, if we want to work for the abolition of alcohol, which was, as I said a little earlier to you offline, a progressive social cause in the 19th century. It was,
Right.
we want to help women and help children, by getting rid of, drunken men who beat their wives and, abuse their children. And so they said, we need to organize women, because women, it was just assumed that all women would be in favor of temperance. And so we need to organize them. We need to get them to sign temperance pledges. We need to get them to get their husbands to sign temperance pledges, and out of that came the WCTU. And Annie was president of that for about 5 years. And under her, it was very specifically focused on temperance. But I know that Nick is going to ask me about her successor, Frances
Yes.
Willard, because under Frances Willard, it remained doing a lot of temperance work, but it began to also get involved in a lot of other social causes as well. So,
Well, and that's a great segue for us to be able to talk about her. Now, how did they literally, expand and create chapters and that kind of thing? You had to have an enormous amount of time to just writing letters all the time, and
yeah, I
maybe
mean, you think about how quickly you can send an email now. And I mean, the telegraph had been, was invented sort of, during the 19th century. And so it was possible, expensive, but possible, to contact people over, to have a more quicker form of contact. But mostly, unless you had an emergency, you wrote people letters. And so all of
Mhm.
this was, you know, they published, periodicals and other literature. And so women would come upon WCTU literature. They would say, I want to form a chapter. They would write, to Annie and then to Frances, and then they would write to the national folks, and the national folks would say, here's what you need to do to form a chapter. And then they would get together and they would have activities and send in, which could be anything from like praying at saloons to you know doing things for kids, who were affected by alcohol abuse. I mean, of their parents' alcohol abuse and that kind of thing. And then they would send in reports, and they had these big national conventions every year.
Mm.
Um, where they would all come and they would hear speeches from the president and from other people to sort of encourage them for the fight. And then more and more, that many of them also in these chapters began to work for legal remedies against prohibition, which is not really part of the Annie story. Annie was much more into what people call moral suasion. Trying to convince people that drinking was a bad idea, but not necessarily codifying it into law. But more and more, and not just the WCTU, but the whole country, as we move towards the establishment of prohibition in the early 20th century, the whole country became full of people and groups who were working for ways um, to forbid the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Starting in Maine in 1851, there was a thing called the Maine Law, which was a prohibition law in Maine. And so for the rest of the century, all the literature is like, wherever it was being written, no, we need a Maine law here. And it was out of and in many places, cities, states, towns, whatever. Some laws would be established, and so national prohibition didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of the work of all of these people, including the
Sure.
WCTU. So
Sure. Well, that's a great way for us to segue and talk about Frances Willard. She's uh, as we think about the 250th anniversary of the United States, and we start to think about places like Washington, D.C., in that frame of reference of all of that as well. Frances Willard is one of the two statues in Statuary Hall that were sent to Statuary Hall by the state of Illinois. The other one being Abraham Lincoln, right? I
yeah,
mean,
no,
so
yeah,
she's in good
it's hard.
company, right? But
Yeah,
I
it's hard
mean,
to underestimate how important Frances Willard, to set the stage here, was Annie
yes.
Wittenmyer's successor as president of the WCTU.
And was she, well, pause there just, was she, did Frances Willard did they kind of run against each other for president,
Yeah,
or
I'm
did?
sorry. You're gonna have to. Oh, sorry. I thought it was Elizabeth. It's fine. Sorry. Could you cut that? Edwin walked in, and
Okay, yeah, we'll make sure we do that.
okay. Sorry. You want to ask that question again, and we'll
Yeah,
get back
yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
Elizabeth. Okay.
Hold on. I need to make sure I see exactly kind of what time frame that was. Okay. Um, so did Frances Willard defeat Annie Wittenmyer for president? Was there a race for it, or did Annie just kind of, you think, understood, hey, this thing's starting to move a different direction than I really want to expand it to, and so she backed out, or she was tired? I'm sure she was tired after, several years of
Yeah.
putting all the
No.
effort
So she
in.
was. So there was. I'm not sure exactly the method they used to, but it was an elected position. So she was already. She was part of the founders. She became the corresponding secretary. So everybody knew her because she was the person when you run into the national office, Frances Willard would write you back. And also she also edited some publications. And so she essentially campaigned for this and was elected,
Okay.
by,
Okay.
by the people who were there.
The delegates
I'm
or
not sure
whatever you
exactly,
would.
how they chose delegates and exactly who could vote and that sort of thing. But she was an elected position that she came
Okay.
to. Yeah, and then she was elected in 1879. So Whitmer had been there 5 years, and then Willard died in the position. She died in 1898. Um, so that's nearly 20 years then that she was president.
Wow. Yeah. But do you know, did Annie stay still active with
No,
the
Annie stayed
WCTU? She
active
did.
for a while, with a caveat. No, Annie stayed active and continued to try to because Frances Willard had this policy called, which she called "do everything." Which, by the way, I want to make sure I stop and mention this. I just finished reading very recently a new biography of Frances Willard, and the biography is called "Do Everything."
Okay.
Yeah, it's by Christopher Evans, from Oxford University Press, and it's not actually. I thought it was the first academic biography of Willard when I was reading it, but it's the first in about 40 years, and it was a really good book. It took her faith seriously, but it also took her politics seriously. So, anyway, some of what I know about her, I learned over the past 3 weeks. But anyway, but the book is called "Do Everything" because that was her motto for the WCTU. She wanted them to be involved in as many reform efforts as possible. In particular, she was very committed to women's suffrage. Um, she was also, although she didn't really press the WCTU on this, I did not realize this until I read the book. She also experienced a call to the ordained ministry, which, because she
Oh,
was a
really?
woman, did not. That's a whole other story about how she
Sure.
she was very close friends with some of the other people who were working for women's ordination and women's representation, as laity at General Conference and all those sorts of things in the Methodist Church. So um, the author of Do Everything seems fairly convinced that she, from her writings and stuff, that she herself felt that she was called into the ministry. But anyway, her idea was that the WCTU should do suffrage, should do other work to help fallen women,
Mm-hmm.
prostitutes, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. So sort of any social cause you could think of that was happening, she wanted the WCTU, with always temperance at the center, but she wanted the WCTU to get involved in it. And Annie was still a member of the WCTU and was still liked and didn't really agree with this, and so was part of some fights that happened against Willard's leadership, particularly about I don't remember the dates exactly. I can look it up, but there was Willard wanted very much to get the WCTU on board as an official supporter of the U.S. Prohibition Party, which was a
Okay.
third party that formed in this era that was a single issue party. The issue was, we want national prohibition, we want state prohibition, we want local prohibition, we want legal prohibition everywhere. And a bunch of people, I just looked up the date, it's 1890, a bunch of people split
Okay.
off from the WCTU and formed what they called the nonpartisan WCTU. And Annie Wittenmyer, she wasn't the leader of that, but she was one of those people, because the idea was this is an organization that will work only for temperance and will not get involved in politics and will not officially support political parties and platforms. So Annie died. I got to actually look at the dates. I'm terrible with remembering dates.
I
So
think it's
Annie died in
1900.
1900. So after that, but she remained involved and opposing Frances Willard until she died.
Wow. How about that? Hey, we're enjoying our conversation that we're having with Dr. Jennifer Woodruff Tait, and we're talking about using the death date of Annie Wittenmyer, the first president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, to so. But from what I pick up on and get me straight on this, Francis is kind of saying, look, we can go out there and tell everybody about why you shouldn't and the evils of alcohol and evils of all of these things. But at the end of the day, the law is what's going to end up making the difference in this. And we have to influence the law being changed. And if we don't change the law, you're not going to do it by sitting on your hands. You got to be in politics of some. You've
Yeah,
got to
and
be
that was
able to.
why
Is
she
that
was such.
kind of right, or is that
That's
not
kind of
right?
right. Yeah,
Okay.
that's basically right. That was why she was so involved in the female suffrage movement. Um,
Mm,
and some of the other people involved in that were like, why are you so involved in temperance? But she was so involved in the suffrage movement because it was assumed that all women would vote against the saloon, as they would have said.
ah,
And so she said, if we give women the vote, we will find it so much easier to pass prohibition laws because women are not going to vote in favor of, keeping saloons open. Women are going to vote for national or state or local prohibition. And so, she was also involved in labor reform. She was also involved, like I said, in working with women who were caught in the sex trade, raising the age of consent, prison reform. She was the Christopher Evans, who wrote the book, is pretty convinced that she was a democratic socialist. She was very progressive economically. So all of these things were part of her, and it was all tied to temperance because she was like, if we have a more humane
mm,
society, if we have people working less hours, if we, do make these economic reforms that she was in favor of, that will help make this a better world in which people will not want to drink. And then also we need to legally, you know, do what we need to do to forbid them from drinking. So it was all of a piece for her, but a lot of people in the WCTU. I mean, she would continue to be supported as president, but also there was continual turmoil around, is Miss Willard taking us sort of like too far
mm.
down these roads? This was something that was continually talked about during her entire tenure. So
What denomination was she?
she was Methodist.
She was too. Okay.
Yeah, no, she was
Okay.
Methodist. In fact, and this is one of my favorite tidbits about her.
Hmm.
She was she was engaged to Methodist preacher. She didn't marry him. She broke off the engagement. She was engaged to a Methodist preacher named Charles Fowler, whose sister, Jenny Fowler Willing, later was basically one of the founders of the Methodist Deaconess movement. So like power
Okay.
family. Um,
Okay.
yeah, and but Frances and Charles, they got engaged, and then she's like, I don't really love you. I don't think I'm cut out to be a pastor's wife. She broke off the engagement, but they remained in contact. So later, he became the president of Northwestern. She became the dean of the women's college, and
Oh man.
they had huge fights about how that was going to be run. And then he became a bishop, and he was one of the bishops of the Methodist Church at the time that she and Anna Howard Shaw and Anna Willard were agitating for women's rights within the Methodist Church, for women to be seated as lay delegates at General Conference, for women's ordination, and he was against that. And so they basically spent the rest of their life in all these different arenas, fighting. And he was also a big temperance advocate.
Okay.
Before I realized he was the ex-fiance of Frances Willard, like he was already in my dissertation of my first book, because he had done so much writing in the area of, so they agreed on that. He had done so much writing against alcohol. They agreed on a lot of these issues, but they also kept being in these positions where they were fighting each other, and I just think that's funny. So
Well, unless, if you don't think history is full of irony, that you don't have to go far in many different places to find there's all kinds of
yeah,
irony going
yeah.
around,
When I,
right?
and I knew that this was the case already when I was reading this biography, but every so often it was like, Christopher Evans would write, and then Charles Fowler came back into her life, as he talked about the next fight they'd had. So I always thought
What,
that was really sort of funny. Here are these two people who might have been like a married power couple fighting
yeah.
temperance, but didn't get married, but continued to fight in their own ways, and those ways often actually brought them into conflict with each other. So, and not fighting temperance, fighting for temperance. So.
For
Yeah.
temperance, but maybe against each other on other issues, right? I
Yeah,
mean, that would
yeah. So
be
that anyway, that's really funny. Charles Fowler is also fascinating. Maybe we should probably do an episode on him someday. So
deal. Well, so if Annie was divorced, and I would assume because she was from Iowa, is that right? And that
Yeah, she
Annie
was
maybe.
actually born in Ohio, which I didn't realize till I looked her up.
Okay.
But she's famous as being from Iowa, and she's in the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame and that sort of thing.
Okay. But then you spoke about her husband, and if you got a divorce in those time period, you really had to have a lot of reason and cause for
Yeah,
that, right? I mean,
I'm sure that there must have been abandonment generally meant that your husband had left you for someone else. So I'm sure that
mm,
there was some clear sexual malfunction, not malfunction, sexual misdoing on his part.
malfeasance. How about
Malfeasance, that's the word I was
that?
looking for.
Yeah, I'll make up that word for not being able to say Annie's name right in the front end.
Yeah.
So we'll go back. So, but what about Frances Willard? What was her home life, married life for? I mean, was
Yeah,
she
she never married.
she never
Um
married? Okay,
no,
so that's her maiden name. Okay.
she dated a couple people. Person she was closest to was Charlie, and she called him Charles Fowler. And after they broke up, after she broke off the engagement, there was never seriously any other man that she seems to have been involved with. She had a sort of a series of very close they don't appear to have been sexual, but very close emotional relationships with various women that she worked with, starting with a woman who became her sister-in-law, her brother, um, Oliver, who actually became an alcoholic, and there was a very
Mm,
personal impetus behind all of that. Married this friend of Frances's named Mary, who was sort of her first big sort of, serious relationship is the wrong word, but I don't know what else to use. And then there were several other people throughout her life where during a period of time they would be extremely close. Um,
hmm
close to the end of her life, Isabel Somerset, who was a British a British woman who was a member of the nobility who had gotten married to a husband. I don't remember if he was an alcoholic, but he was a jerk. Um,
Okay.
as my kids would say, he was a fart. And he so this terrible, I don't think she ever divorced him, but she separated from him. It was
Mm,
clear, it was clear that he'd done all this bad stuff. And so Frances and Isabel became very close, and then and Isabel was very active in the British temperance movement, and so Frances spent a lot of time close to the end of her life in Britain,
ah,
touring around and trying to get temperance things going in Britain. And that was actually, I mean, she died before anybody threw her out of the presidency of the WCTU. But there was a lot of rumbling at that point, and I learned a lot of this from the book. There was a lot of rumbling at that point around why doesn't Miss Willard come back to America? And then her health was poor. Her health was poor her whole life. So then she was over there. She's like, well, I'm going over for like 6 months. And then she was over there for like 2 years because she was so
wow.
sick she couldn't come back. So people felt sort of like she's kind of abandoned the American fight right at the time that we need her for these various things, to go off to Britain. She was also very close to her mother. Her father died fairly young. And her mother, who was called Mother Willard, and people sort of knew her as kind of part of the WCTU.
Okay.
Her mother lived in the family home, and Frances was always on the road, so she was never home. But
Which is
when she was
Springfield,
home,
right? Was it
what?
Springfield? Well, where were they? Where
Then
in the
we're north of Evanston.
Evanston?
Um,
Okay, all right.
yeah, yeah. So her mother lived there, and like people would just show up to see Mother Willard and talk about temperance, even if Frances wasn't home. Her mother lived there. Then, as I said, her brother Oliver, Frances's brother Oliver, was an alcoholic. He died fairly young. So then the sister-in-law moved back in.
Mm,
Um, there were various people sort of living there, and so that until her mother died, that was very much her home. And then after that, she didn't sell it, but she spent a lot of time on the road and living other places. There was also a young woman who basically traveled with her all the time as her secretary. Her name was Anna Gordon. And so she also lived at Rest Cottage, was what it was called. She also lived there. So there was this sort of house full of women working for temperance, Mother Willard, Frances, Anna Gordon, Mary Willard, who was Frances's sister-in-law. And anyway, so that was kind of what her home life was like. But she literally, I mean, do everything was not just for her. It was sort of like she did everything all the time, like she was never.
right,
Yeah.
right. Well, you wonder too, I guess, had she had, children that she had to get back and help raise and do, I mean, how much effort would she have been able to put in doing everything? She
Right. I
might
mean,
have
I
had to
think
do
one
just
reason,
something. Right?
I think genuinely, she broke up with Charles Fowler because she realized that she couldn't, if she was going to do what she felt she had been called to do, and work in these social arenas, you know it wasn't just, oh, I don't love you like that. It was like, I don't think I'm called to be a wife and mother because I'm called to do
Mm-hmm.
these other things. And Annie Wittenmyer, as I said, she had 4 children, but 3 of them died young. So it's a lot easier to travel around and do things with one child.
Yeah.
So yeah, Willard was basically sort of married to the cause.
Ah,
I don't know if she would have explicitly put it like that, but clearly, and never met anyone who she thought either would allow her to be married to the cause or for whom she felt like giving up the cause. So
wow. What a fascinating time period, right? And particularly, about how much interest just on it really kind of I have to kind of stop and rewind and think through about creating and developing and keeping up with so many of these chapters and who the people were and how they
yeah, and I mean,
paid their
she had a
dues. And
staff.
I mean, it just was,
Yeah,
it's just
she had a
mind-boggling.
staff. So she herself started as corresponding secretary. So it was Annie Wittenmyer's job to sort of cast a vision. And it was Frances Willard's job to answer the letters. So when she
Hmm.
became president, there were various secretaries, and Anna Gordon, who, as I said, was this young woman who traveled with her, basically ran her schedule. It was like taking your administrative assistant on the road with you, and people would write to
Sure.
Anna and say, can Miss Willard come speak? And Anna would kind of make all those arrangements and then tell Frances, okay, today you're going here. So she didn't do it all by herself, but she
No,
still,
right.
she
But
was,
still, even.
yeah, she was in her 50s when she died. And I mean, and I feel this, I thought this before, and after I read the biography, I really thought this. I'm like, she just sort of wore herself out.
Yeah.
She just, she was like, felt like she single-handedly, I think, even though she had all this help, single-handedly, needed to bring in a better world, and she
Yeah.
was going to die trying, and that's exactly what happened.
And literally do that. Right. Where
Yeah,
are there archives of all the WCTU somewhere where all
there
this
are.
chapters?
I actually don't know where they are, but I'm kind of assuming they're at Northwestern. I know that in the Do Everything, Christopher Evans refers to many things he's consulted, and talks about where they all are.
Okay.
So there's WCTU archives, there's their own papers, and a lot of those have been preserved. Um, and like I said, I'm 90% sure they're at Northwestern, but
Sure. Well,
people
that
should
would
check.
make
People
sense.
should check on that. I did not
Okay.
look this up before I got on. It would make a
That's,
ton of sense for them to be at Northwestern or somewhere in Evanston, but I
yeah,
don't actually know.
in that greater world up there. Right. To
Yeah,
be able to. Is her home still as
I believe it is
Francis's
still.
home still there in
I
Evanston?
believe it's still standing. As a
Okay.
historical building. That's another thing I should have checked on and didn't.
No, no, no. I'm
Yeah,
just
but
curious. I mean,
I that's my understanding that it's preserved either by the WCTU or by, the city or whatever. But
sure.
again, that's something you should go Google before you go
We'll
try to
go do that.
visit.
Well, no, I'll get a student maybe to run
Yeah, get a
traps on
student to put it in the show
that.
notes. But
That's a great way to get extra credit, right? For us to
yeah,
be able to talk about that
uh,
when we
yeah.
start
To
to
the
talk.
best of my knowledge, it is still there.
Okay, very fantastic. Hey, Dr. Jennifer Woodruff Tait, once again, thank you for all of your knowledge. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for your support for the Center for Christian History as well as our podcast. And remind people on how they can find copies of Christian History Magazine.
Okay, so if you just Google Christian history, I would say not to do that because um, what you should do is Google Christian History Institute. That
Right.
will get our site. Because for about 20 years, as some people know, the magazine was at Christianity Today. Lots more people read Christianity Today than read Christian history. And so if you just Google Christian history, their site will come up first. But anyway, ChristianHistoryInstitute.org is our site. And that has the text of all 100 and I think the one that's about to come out is 158, all at this point 157 issues that have been published, as well as a couple other extra guides. We did a bonus guide on the liturgical year last year,
Hmm.
which I wrote the text to. We've done bonus guides on other things. So all that stuff is available for free at the website. Everything since issue 100 is available in full color download PDFs. And if you like print and you actually want a print copy, you can buy them there. And if you buy them in bulk, if you want to use them in a Sunday school class or, an
Hmm.
undergraduate class or hand them out at your church or whatever, you can get bulk discounts if you want to buy a bunch of them. So, and then there's all kinds of other resources there. There's
Oh, yeah.
podcast, blog, I'm not even sure, but all kinds of teaching modules, all sorts of resources there,
Right.
for bringing Christian history into the church, or into homeschooling education,
Sure.
or an undergraduate class, or
Sure. Well, we're about to be listed on one of the preferred podcasts on the CHI website. So we know
uh,
that should be happening about the time that we release this episode. So
right. Oh, and
that's a
we also
great.
have a Substack. They've just started a Substack. So,
Oh, really?
and right now
Okay.
everyone's signing up for Substack. So Christian History Institute has one, and that releases articles from the magazine and other interesting things. So,
Hmm.
sign up for that as well. So,
As long as you're signing up, get all of it in there.
as long as you're
Fantastic.
signing up, it's all, unless everything other than buying print copies is actually free.
Isn't that
Um,
great? Oh, well,
yeah,
that's
and buying
a
print
certain
copies,
ministry.
is not free, but is also, I think, not incredibly expensive. So,
Right, right. Well, it's definitely worth the value. I can more than there's way more value than what you would have to pay for about what's there to do too. So, thank you so much for joining us yet again. For folks to remember, follow us on our social media that we are on X and on Facebook and as well on Instagram, where we post every day something unique that happened in Christian history on that day. Many of our ideas about what to post we got from Christian History Magazine, and so the good work that was done as a part of that. So thank you for helping us celebrate our 50th podcast, and we can't wait for the next 50. Right.
yeah,
Take care.
always glad to be here.
Thank you.